Hey everyone, let's talk about chapter 2, our consumer behavior book. And this one is on culture. And so let me switch over to our slides. So chapter 2 is on culture. And let's just start by thinking about something that is very culturally normal or a norm in American society, something that our American culture influences our behavior in terms of activities that we're doing and consuming and things that we're actually purchasing. So you see here we have an image of a 4th of July cookout. So think to yourself about not last year, but the year before and past years of what a 4th of July cookout looks like for you, or what your 4th of July celebration looks like. Did you do some sort of picnic or a cookout? Did you spend time with family? Did you spend time with friends? What kinds of foods did you eat? Did you eat hamburgers, hot dogs, other barbecue or grilling out kinds of foods, watermelon, like potato salad, all of those sorts of things are, very typical consumption products that Americans purchase for 4th of July cookouts. What did you wear? Did you wear something that was red, white, and blue? What did you do at the barbecue or at the cookout? Did you watch fireworks? Did you play cornhole or some sort of other outdoor games? How was the event, or how was your home decorated? All of these sorts of things are influenced by the American culture. Okay, so in 2019, in 2019, 86% of Americans reported that they were planning to celebrate the 4th of July. 61% of Americans said they were going to attend some sort of picnic. The planned spending for food was $6.8 billion. 150 million hot dogs are consumed on average for each 4th of July. And then even the 2017, looking at a grocery list and how many millions of dollars were planned to be spent on the kind of top few different types of foods that we would often see at a 4th of July event. So this is one small example of an event or ritual or tradition that is traditional for a particular culture, okay? So the chapter itself is not just on culture here in America, but in comparing cultures, especially when companies move to foreign countries and things that they have to consider. So looking at our overarching framework for the class, we are starting right here, up here on the top, with external influences, and this one again is culture. So when we look at marketing decisions in terms of culture, a lot of things can be very different in terms of variances between different cultures that a firm might be interested in. And let's see if this works here. So if you actually, we're not going to watch this in this video, but I just want to show you. You could either click in the actual folder. Let's see. In the folder online, you can also just click here on this slide and you can look at the differences, some differences as exhibited by Oreo in terms of how they've marketed and advertised around the world in different countries. Some of the top areas in terms of consumer behavior that we see differences are, of course, things like language, tons of examples of companies, even big companies, and even relatively recent examples of companies not doing a very good job of adapting to whatever the local language is. A lot of times, what we hope to see from company is that you would go and you would translate your slogan into the local language and then confirm that that's actually what it means in the local language. The direct translation is appropriate in terms of what you're actually meaning to say. What we've seen is that when companies just use a direct translation without doing any additional research, is that they kind of get into trouble a lot of times. For example, a few years ago, when Pepsi had a slogan that was said, it was along the lines of "for the next generation." When they translated that into their advertising for the Chinese market, the direct translation was there, but the meaning of it actually translated to something more along the lines of Pepsi will raise your ancestors from the dead. And so that did not go over very well with the Chinese market. And so language is a big barrier. Demographics can be a big barrier. We'll talk about that later. And then, of course, values, which we're going to talk about in this chapter, and nonverbal communication. So nonverbal communications is included in this chapter, and so I encourage you to read that in the textbook. For the purposes of this little mini lecture, we are going to focus on values and then briefly also talk about demographics. Just for quick definitional purposes, culture is this very complex concept that includes so many things in a particular society. Typically includes knowledge, belief, art, laws, morals, standards, customs and traditions and rituals, and any other capabilities or even habits that are acquired by people as they are members of a particular society. What we see is that cultural values lead to norms that tell us what the appropriate behavior is, as well as sanctions, which will be penalties for violating those norms. Not penalties like prison, but just social penalties typically for violating cultural norms. And then both of those things, both the norms and the sanctions, do lead to differences in consumption. Things that are purchased in order to stay within those norms typically and avoid sanctions. Culture, of course, is not a static thing. It is very dynamic. It does change over time. Typically, that's a very slow progression over time, but it does change. So cultural values, so many different values that we could talk about. Your textbook talks about all of them, so please do make sure to read all of these sections. If we look at this self versus other oriented values, the research really breaks this into these kind of different categories: active versus passive. And as you think about these, you think about in America, what is the typical cultural value for each of these? Is it typically active, or is it typically passive? Would be in America, would it typically be sensual gratification that's focused on, or abstinence? Material goods versus non-material, hard work versus leisure, postponed gratification versus immediate gratification, and religious versus secular. And even these have really evolved in the last 50, definitely 100 years, but even 50 or 35, 25 years. we've seen changes in a lot of these. The U.S. was founded by pretty religious people who actually came here to avoid religious persecution. And so we've moved from a mainly religious society to a more secular society now. And so we do see some of those changes. So understanding that in whatever culture that a company is going to be advertising or communicating with customers in, it's helpful to know which of these that particular area or country leans towards, and it helps them figure out how to best communicate with those consumers. Then we have environment-oriented values. Excuse me. Kind of the same thing: cleanliness versus messiness, performance versus status, etc. And so you can sort of think about, where do you think the United States culture is here, the American culture? And then the other oriented values, these are probably the most common values that we see looked at in terms of consumer behavior on a cross-cultural basis. These are been widely and are still researched today, to compare different countries on these different elements and these different characteristics. So typically we would consider the US to be an individualistic type of culture. It focuses predominantly on youth, focuses predominantly on more limited family nucleus as opposed to nuclear family, as opposed to more extended family. Masculine versus feminine is relatively balanced in the US, definitely more competitive than cooperative, which goes along with that individualistic, and then definitely embraces more diversity than uniformity. So let's look at these and just sort of, here are some questions that we would pose for each of these to sort of ponder: is a country that we're thinking of individual, which way does it lean on each of these values? So is it more individualistic or more collectivistic? We could ask, are individual activity and initiative valued more than collective activity, group activity, and conformity? So typically we would consider the United States to be a very individualistic culture. And then the flip of that would be the Chinese culture is generally considered to be very collectivistic, though it has shifted at least a little bit towards the individualistic, but is still pretty collectivistic. So here's Hofstede is the very famous researcher who has looked at these different values. And so you can see here kind of where different places in the world rank in terms of valuing collectivism versus individualism. Okay. And then youth and age, are wisdom and prestige assigned to younger or older members of a culture? And is family life organized to meet the needs of children or of the adults? Right? Generally, again, we would consider the United States to be somewhat of a youth-oriented culture. Okay. Extended and limited family, to what extent does one have a lifelong obligation to numerous family members? So one good indicator here, probably in terms of looking at that particular question, is how are the elderly treated, and how are they valued? And so in some countries, China particularly, and others, it is expected that couples or a family would take in their parents or in-laws as they get older, and they would actually live with them, and they would be taken care of in the home, versus in the United States, it's very typical to move our elderly family members into group home type settings, assisted living and nursing homes. And so there's sort of a monetary obligation there sometimes, but definitely not the same type of obligation and not the same strength of obligation that we see in other countries. Masculine versus feminine, to what extent does social power automatically go to males? This used to be certainly shifted towards the masculine at the 50 to 100 years ago, but is certainly much more balanced now. And if you look at this, this actually is another scale or some more research by Hofstede that looks at masculinity versus femininity in cultures. And so you can see the US is very balanced. We have some countries that lean towards the masculine, like China, Mexico, the Philippines. And then you have a few that are lean toward the feminine, which are predominantly in Scandinavia, Iceland, and in those countries. So we, definitely see some differences here among countries. And then how do you excel, basically, is this next cultural value? Is it mostly competition based, or is it more cooperation based? And so definitely in the United States, we see it's more competitive based. Whereas in some places, excuse me, it's typically, China's oftentimes the opposite. And that's the case with this one as well. Diversity and uniformity. How much does the culture embrace variation in different types of religious beliefs, ethnic backgrounds, political views, and so on and so forth? So in the United States, definitely we lean towards the diversity more so than the conformity, perhaps more so than any other country on earth, just because of the history of so many immigrants in the United States. So an example here, looking at least ethnic background or racial background, this was a survey that was done, I think, by the Washington, or at least posted by the Washington Post. I'm not sure who did the survey. Looking at a survey question about when asked to pick from, this is the share of people that answered people of another race when asked to pick from groups of people they would not want as neighbors. Okay. And so you can see here definitely some big differences in terms of what percentage of people said they would be okay with or would not be okay with people of another race being their neighbors. And so you can see India was more than 40%. Whereas the United States, Canada, Scandinavia, Australia, the UK, less than 5% answered that way. So, there's just that kind of leads us to this, again, this idea of diversity versus uniformity or conformity. Okay. All right, so those are the main characteristics or different types of cultural values. That probably the most researched are those other oriented values that we just talked about. And then how do we apply this? So just a quick example, if you look at the self-oriented value of sensual gratification versus abstinence, this particular ad here would be acceptable in the US and France, where sensual gratification is more valued than abstinence, but would not be appropriate in some cultures that place a high value on abstinence, or would definitely be the cultural norm would not be towards showing this much skin in an advertisement. Okay, and then let's look at global demographics. So looking at global demographics helps us to understand, can help us to at least get some idea of how countries may score or may behave in terms of some of those values that we just talked about. For example, densely populated societies are typically more of a collectivist society versus an individual one, whereas the US is, has significantly fewer people, but on a much larger landmass. And so there's that just lends itself to a more individualistic society. So let's talk about global demographics here. One of the things that marketers use to compare countries is to use this PPP metric, purchasing power parity. So basically, how much would it cost in each country to buy the standard market basket of products that they've determined, okay? And so it's just 4 countries looking real quickly. We can compare per capita income as well as per capita purchasing power parity, and then what percentage of total income goes to the top 10% of earners in that country. Okay, so you can see in this comparison, and I think this is from about 2016 data. That was the most recent that I had, but there may be more out there. But it hasn't changed much the last time I looked. It's still relatively close to this. So you have the United States at the average or the per capita income is around $42,000. The United Kingdom is relatively similar at $37,000. If you looked at this PPP metric, how much does it cost? The United States is sort of the standard that we compare to for that. So in the United States, it just is $41,674. Okay, in the United Kingdom, it would cost $31,000 to purchase that same basket of goods. Okay, in China, the per capita income is $1,700 US, and it would cost $4,000 about to buy that basket of goods in China. And then in Brazil, we've got about $5,000 as the per capita income and $8,500 as that PPP metric. Okay. And then really interesting to look at the the percentage of total income that goes to the top 10%. Brazil is definitely the highest, at least on this list, at 45%, which is, I mean, that's crazy. That's a lot. And then China, United States, and the United Kingdom are less than that at between 30 and 35%. So this sort of gives you an idea of differences among countries and helps us to understand, consumer behavior in those countries, what types of goods they might be able to afford, and those sorts of things. Helps us understand our pricing. Okay, as companies move into global markets, there are a lot of questions that have to be answered. Here are just 7 that would be specific to marketing. That would have talked a lot about some of these in the principles of marketing class, right? Like the political and legal structures, what types of, they talk about cultural and value there. Are there ethical implications that we would need to consider? What values exist in that country, and then specifically which ones are actually relevant to our product and our brand, right? Can our product fill needs in this culture? Is there something else there already? Is the market big enough? Are there enough people who have enough money to purchase the product? And a variety of other things. Are there, what are the guidelines in terms of how we can communicate about the product? What is the infrastructure in terms of distributing the product? All of those sorts of things. How, what percentage of the population uses the internet, and is that a growing area, or listen to the radio, or are we even allowed to advertise our product in this particular country because of certain guidelines or laws? So all these things are really important to really dig in deeply to as you look into going into a foreign market and approaching that foreign market, and really thinking about, do we need, can we use the same messaging we have in our home country? Do we need to, can we keep the same messaging, but maybe use a more local Celebrity spokesperson. McDonald's has done that with their I'm Loving It slogan. They had kept the slogan, kept sort of the song. They used, I think it was Justin Timberlake in the US, and then a Chinese pop star in China. And the ads were just slightly different in terms of the values that they sort of hit on. But it was still the same slogan and still, similar themes in the ads. Sometimes we have to completely scrap the theme and scrap the slogan and come up with something new. Or other times we could maybe actually use the same messaging and the same slogans, those sorts of things in the new country. So all of those things are really important to consider. Okay. McDonald's was very famous also for their like local menus, right? You have all the standard McDonald's stuff, and then you have local things that are specific to that particular area. Okay. And that's it. Those are the things I just really wanted to talk about briefly. Again, I encourage you to read the chapter. There's a lot of really good examples included in the textbook as well. And I will see you back here for chapter 3. Have a good one.